A 22-year-old American pilot named Marion Carl was battling for his life on October 9, 1942, 20,000 feet over a rainforest island called Guadalcanal. He was flying a Grumman F4F Wildcat, a short, heavy fighter that was based on a ship. People were looking for him. His enemy was a Mitsubishi A6M0, a plane that was so light and quick that it seemed like it came from the future. It could turn inside the Wildcat's area twice. It may go up like a rocket. The Zero had been a ghost for the past year, a phantom that dominated the skies from Pearl Harbor to the Philippines. Marion Carl was a great player, but right now he was simply a body. The Zero was just behind him. He made his Wildcat dive. The big American plane sped up, but the Zero stayed with it. He rolled hard right. The Wildcat responded, but slowly. Like the P-38, it seemed mushy. The Zero was already there, anticipating his move, its cannons blinking. Carl's cockpit exploded. Shrapnel tore through his leg. His controls went dead. He was going down. He managed to bail out, landing in the shark-infested waters, saved only by a miracle. This was the reality of the air battle in the Pacific. This was Guadalcanal. But just weeks later, another farm boy from South Dakota would climb into the same sky and change everything. It wasn't a war. It was a meat grinder, a site where American pilots were being fed one by one into the teeth of the Japanese war machine. The American press called the pilots there the Cactus Air Force. The pilots themselves called their base Henderson Field, the graveyard. The problem wasn't just the Zero. It was the doctrine. The experts back in America, the engineers, had an easy answer. Never turn with a Zero. It was the same doctrine as the P-38 pilots. Use your speed, use your armor, dive, shoot, and run. But in the chaotic, swirling dog battles over Guadalcanal, that doctrine was getting soldiers murdered every single day. The Japanese pilots were veterans. They had battled over China, over Pearl Harbor. They knew their airplanes. They enticed the Americans into turning. They knew the Wildcat was slow to respond. They knew just where to fire. The Americans were losing terribly. What the Cactus Air Force didn't know, what the veteran Japanese pilots couldn't possibly know, was that the solution was on its way. But it wasn't a new plane. It wasn't a new doctrine from Washington. It was a 27-year-old farmer, a man so unassuming he had been told he was too old to fly in war. A man who had learned to shoot, not from a military manual, but by shooting jackrabbits on the frigid plains of South Dakota. This is the story of Joseph J. Foss and the simple, forgotten farmer's technique that made him America's ace of aces. To understand how a single farmer might scare the Japanese Air Force, you first have to comprehend the farm. Foss was not a career soldier. He was born in 1915 on a remote, unelectrified farm in Sioux Falls, South Dakota. His childhood wasn't spent in classes. It was spent in the mud, in the cold, and in the wind. This was the David versus Goliath story, just like Simoheha. But Foss's Goliath wasn't merely the opponent. It was life itself. The Great Depression slammed South Dakota like an artillery assault. The land dried up. The crops failed. The family had nothing. Foss's sisu, that finishing grid, was built from need. He and his father would hunt to put food on the table. And this is when the secret alteration begins. When a 12-year-old Joe Foss hunted jackrabbits, he didn't have a scope. He had an ancient shotgun and one rule from his father: don't squander shells. A jackrabbit doesn't run in a straight path. It weaves, It darts. It reverses. To hit it, you couldn't aim at it. You have to aim where it was going to be. It's called deflection shooting. While other students were studying math, Foss was calculating lead, windage, and speed in his head in a fraction of a second. He wasn't only a good shot, he was a predator. He grasped the science of hitting a moving target. This was his iron sight. This was his piano wire. It was a farmer's eye that military manuals couldn't teach. But Foss didn't want to hunt bunnies. He longed to fly. In 1933, his father took him to an aviation show. He witnessed a Marine Corps squadron flying biplanes. He was 18 years old, and he was hooked. He told his father, "That's what I'm going to do." The path was insurmountable. He was a poor rural child. He had no education. When his father was tragically murdered by a power line, Joe, at 19, had to drop out of school to operate the farm. He was stuck, but he had that sisu. He farmed the farm by day and studied night studies. It took him 6 years to obtain enough credits to enter college. He worked his way through washing dishes to acquire a pilot's license. When Pearl Harbor was attacked, Joe Foss was 27 years old. He raced to enlist in the Navy to be a pilot. He was rejected. He was too old. In 1941, the cutoff age for a fighter pilot was 25 years old. They told him he might be a flight instructor, teach other kids how to fly. It was a catastrophic blow. It was the engineering officer assuring McKenna the cables were within spec. It was the specialists telling Simo Heha to use a scope. The doctrine declared he was unsuitable for combat. So Foss did what McKenna did. He broke the rules. He spotted a loophole. He joined the Marine Corps Reserve. He became an instructor, and for 9 hard months, he watched as 20-year-old kids he had trained were shipped off to war. Foss was outraged. He hounded his bosses. He demanded combat. He wrote letters. He made noise. He was, in his own words, the loudest, most obnoxious instructor in the Navy. Finally, just to shut him up, they gave in. They sent him to advanced fighter training. He was posted to a new unit, VMF 121. And in October 1942, while Marion Carl was being blasted out of the sky, 27-year-old Grandpa Foss, the old farmer from South Dakota, was put aboard a transport ship. His objective? Henderson Field, Guadalcanal. The place he landed at was not a military installation. It was horrible. The moment he stepped off the plane, the smell hit him. A thick, humid mix of engine oil, rotting jungle, and death. The runway was a pockmarked strip of dirt and gravel dug out of the palm trees. The operations center was a wooden cabin named the Pagoda. The pilot's accommodations were mud-floored tents, and everywhere were the wrecks. Dozens of F4F Wildcats, P-39s, shoved to the side of the runway, their wings torn off, their engines destroyed, their cockpits soiled. This was the graveyard of the Cactus Air Force. Foss was allotted to his tent. He met the people he would be flying with. They weren't the fresh-faced kids he had trained. They were ghosts. Their faces were yellow with atabrain, the anti-malaria medicine. Their eyes were bloodshot from lack of sleep. Their flight suits were soiled with sweat and grease. They were veterans, but they were also hunted. Foss, the old man, the farmer, walked in. They stared at him. He was new meat. He was another body to replace the one they lost yesterday. Foss gazed at his assigned jet, a Grumman F4F Wildcat. It was the same plane Marion Carl was shot out in. It was heavy. It was slow.
It was, by all accounts, a flying coffin against the zero. The squadron's executive officer, a man named Duke, delivered Foss the routine briefing. the one that was getting them all killed. Never turn with a zero, never. Joe Foss listened. He nodded. He comprehended the words, but he also knew something the theology had missed. He comprehended jackrabbits. The next morning, Foss would fly his first mission. He was heading straight into the kill zone. He was a farmer in a flying coffin, about to confront the most advanced fighter plane on Earth. And he was about to use a trick that wasn't in any instruction. Joe Foss's maiden flight over Guadalcanal was not a training run. It was a trial by fire. He climbed to 15,000 feet, his gaze scouring the empty blue. The ghosts in his squadron had warned him. They come out of the sun. You never see them until they're shooting at you. Foss was conducting his first patrol, and he felt blind. Then the radio crackled. "Bandits, 11 o'clock high." Foss looked up. He saw them, a formation of Mitsubishi Zeros, sinking. They were swift, faster than anything he had ever seen. He remembered his orders: never turn, dive and run. Foss slammed his stick forward, sent his Wildcat into a roaring dive. His hefty plane accelerated. The Zeros followed. One of them opened fire. Tracers whizzed by Foss's canopy, near enough to make him wince. He kept descending, all the way to the jungle canopy, shaking the Zeros off his tail. He returned to Henderson Field, his hands shaking, not from fear, but from rage. The doctrine was faulty. He knew it. You couldn't win by running away. You could only endure. And Joe Foss hadn't come here to survive. He had come here to hunt. On October 13th, 2 days after his arrival, Foss was heading another patrol. This time they came into a group of Japanese bombers protected by Zeros. The dogfight began. It was chaos. Wildcats and Zeros swirling in the sky. Foss spotted a Zero lock onto his wingman's tail. The Japanese pilot was closing in for the kill. The doctrine claimed Foss should dive away, find an easier target. The farmer's sight said something different. Foss rolled his Wildcat hard. He wasn't aiming at the Zero. He was aiming where the jackrabbit was going to be. He pulled the trigger. His .650 caliber machine gun sprang to life. He fired a long 3-second burst, not at the opposing jet, but at a piece of empty blue sky 200 feet in front of it. It appeared like a blunder, a wasted shot. But the Japanese pilot, concentrating on his own kill, didn't notice Foss. He completed a flawless tight spin and flew directly into the stream of .50 caliber shots. The Zero's wings simply came off. The plane vanished in a swirl of metal and flames. It was Foss's first kill. He had not outturned the Zero. He had not outrun it. He had outthought it. He had utilized the farmer's logic that the professionals in Washington had forgotten. He landed at Henderson Field a different man. The ghosts crowded around him. He had his first kill. He told his crew chief, "This plane, it's a truck, but it's a tough truck and it shoots straight." He told his fellow pilots, "Forget what they told you. Don't chase them. Lead them. Lead them until you think you're going to miss, then lead them some more. They will fly right into it." This was the piano wire modification. This was the iron sight logic. It wasn't a physical modification to the plane. It was a mental change. It was a farmer's confidence. The pilots listened. They were desperate. Their ace, Marion Carl, was still healing. They needed a leader. And this 27-year-old farmer was the only one talking about hunting, not jogging. Foss seized command of his fleet of 8 Wildcats. They were a bunch of misfits, the cast-offs, the new arrivals. They didn't have a cool nickname. So the press, witnessing this old man lead his crazy squadron, gave them one. They called them Foss's Flying Circus. And on October 16th, the circus got to work. Foss led his 8 planes directly into a formation of 32 Japanese aircraft. 32 to 8. It was suicide, but Foss had a plan. He wasn't going to dogfight. He was going to utilize his farmer's logic. He instructed his aircraft to use the thatch weave, a new strategy where pilots flew in pairs, protecting each other's tails. Foss dove in. He saw a Zero. He didn't turn. He pulled lead, fired. The Zero exploded. Another Zero dove on him. Foss's wingman, who was weaving with him, noticed it. The wingman rolled around and shot the Zero off Foss's tail. The Circus was a machine. In 10 minutes of fierce, swirling combat, Foss's flight of 8 shot down 5 Japanese planes. Foss himself earned 2. The Circus returned to base with all 8 planes. The graveyard was now winning. The statistics started to increase, and they climbed at a rate that nobody could believe. It was Simo Heila's kill count all over again. October 18th, Foss fires down 2 more. October 20th, he downs another. By October 23rd, just 10 days after his first kill, Joe Foss was an ace with 5 triumphs. October 25th, he shoots down 3 Zeros in a single day. The old man, the farmer, was suddenly the deadliest pilot on the island. He wasn't merely a pilot, he was a leader. His flying carnival was dominating the sky. But like Simo Heha, this kind of achievement comes at a cost. The Japanese were now enraged. They were losing planes at an impossible rate. Their seasoned pilots were being shot down by Wildcats. It didn't make sense. And the name they kept hearing in their radio intercepts was Foss. The Japanese high command began to notice. Just like Stavka noticed Simo. Just like Saburo Sakai noticed the P-38s. The opponent was adapting. They weren't only fighting Wildcats, they were hunting Foss's flying Circus. The war became personal. On November 7th, Foss was leading his aircraft when they were jumped by an elite set of Japanese aces. The sky was crowded with planes. Foss shot down 2 Zeros. He was lining up a third when his plane was blasted apart by cannon fire from behind. His engine erupted, his cockpit filled with smoke. He was going down. He managed to jump out, his plane falling into the woods. He was recovered, startled but unhurt. Just 2 days later, he was back in the air. This time, he was chasing a Japanese float plane. He was so concentrated on the kill, he didn't see the Jake float plane's rear gunner. The gunner began fire. The gunshots wrecked his engine. For the second time in 3 days, his plane was dead. But this time, he wasn't above the forest. He was above the ocean. He ditched his Wildcat in the water. The plane hit the waves forcefully and sank in less than 30 seconds. Foss was alone in the middle of the Pacific, 10 miles from land. He was in the slot, one of the most shark-infested waters on Earth. He floated in his life vest, the water turning frigid. He had that sisu. He was a farmer. He was used to waiting. He was used to surviving.
But then he noticed these fins, dozens of them. Sharks. They circled him. They bumped him. Foss, the guy who pursued Zeros, was now being hunted by something far older. He treaded water. He waited. He watched the fins grow closer. He had no weapon, no radio, just his farmer's grit. For 4 hours he floated, surrounded. Just as the light was fading, a canoe appeared. It was manned by native islanders dispatched by an Australian coast watcher who had by sheer luck observed the jet go down. They paddled toward him, banging the water with their oars to warn the sharks away. They hauled the weary hypothermic pilot from the water. When they got him back to Henderson Field, he was a wreck. He was suffering from exposure. He had malaria. The doctors ordered him grounded. Joe Foss, the ace of aces, was put in a hospital bed. His flying circus had to fly without him.
The Japanese believed he was dead. The ghost of Guadalcanal had finally gone. They were wrong. Joe Foss lay in that bed for 2 weeks, trembling with fever, thinking about only one thing. The jackrabbits were getting away. He recovered. He walked out of the hospital, hopped back into a fresh Wildcat, and on November 30th, he went hunting again. He shot down another Zero. The ghost came back, and he was angry. The Japanese threw everything they had at him. He continued coming. By January 15, 1943, Joe Foss's tally was at 23. He was just 3 kills short from the all-time American record, a mark achieved in World War I by the renowned Eddie Rickenbacker. Rickenbacker's record was 26 kills. It was a hallowed number, a number no pilot had ever touched. And now, a 27-year-old farmer from South Dakota in a flying coffin was ready to reach that peak. January 15, 1943. This was the day. Foss was sick, sicker than he'd ever been. The physicians had prevented him from flying. He disregarded them. He hauled himself into his cockpit, his head hammering. The word was out. A big Tokyo Express. A vast Japanese naval convoy was heading toward the island, protected by a massive screen of fighters. Foss and his flying circus were sent aloft to intercept. The sky grew black with planes. It was the largest air fight Foss had ever witnessed. Zeros and Wildcats collided in a violent, swirling melee. Foss, his vision impaired by fever, fell back on his instincts. He fell back on the farm. He noticed a Zero locking on to a wingman. He didn't think, he responded. He rolled his Wildcat, not at the Zero, but at the empty spot where the jackrabbit was going to be. He fired. His .50 calibers blasted the empty air. The Zero, committing to its maneuver, flew directly into the wall of lead. The plane disintegrated. That was kill number 24. He scanned the combat. Another Zero was diving on a different set of Wildcats. Foss slammed his throttle forward, his engine shrieking. He cut the Zero off. The Japanese pilot, sighting Foss, tried to outturn him. The typical Zero strategy. Foss didn't take the bait. He performed a high side pass, a maneuver he had perfected. He rolled over the top of the Zero, came down from its blind spot, and fired a single perfect burst. The Zero's engine detonated. That was kill number 25. He had tied Rickenbacker. He was now officially a living legend. But he wasn't done. He noticed another Japanese jet, a roof float plane fighter, trying to flee the combat. Foss dove. The roof pilot noticed him coming and pulled into a desperate ascending spin. This was the ultimate test, the farmer's eye versus the veteran Japanese pilot. Foss didn't just follow, he calculated. He noticed the roof's line of escape. He thrust his own plane's nose up, firing a long, arcing deflection shot that seemed to defy physics. The .50 caliber shots traveled in a precise line, meeting the exact location in the sky where the roof was trying to flee. The plane was hit right in the cockpit. It crashed, crashing end over end into the Pacific. That was kill number 26. In a single afternoon, while shivering with malaria, Joe Foss had shot down 3 enemy planes. He had tied and then broken the unbeatable record. He landed his Wildcat at Henderson Field. The entire base was waiting. The graveyard had become a field of victory. The spirits of the Cactus Air Force grabbed their too-old farmer out of his cockpit and carried him on their shoulders. He was, without question, America's ace of aces. But what the pilots on Guadalcanal applauded, the Japanese high command in Rabaul grieved. This is the Suburo Sakai moment. This is the Peel's diary, the enemy reaction. For months, Japanese pilots had operated with absolute confidence. They were flying the A6M0, a marvel of engineering. They were veterans. They knew the F4F Wildcat was inferior. They had slaughtered scores of them. Their doctrine was basic. Force the Wildcat into a turn, get it on its six, and kill it. Then Foss's flying circus emerged, and suddenly the doctrine stopped operating. Veteran Japanese pilots would return to their ships, their faces pallid, their hands quivering. They gave their intelligence operatives stories that made no sense. They stated they would dive on a Wildcat, expecting it to run, but it wouldn't. They said they would bait it into a turn, but it wouldn't follow. Instead, the American plane would do something weird. It would roll, or ascend, or dive, seemingly at random. Fire its weapons onto empty sky, and then a second later, the Zero next to them would explode. They couldn't understand what was happening. They were being persecuted by a farmer's logic they couldn't fathom. Joe Foss had done exactly what Simo Häyhä had done. He had taken away the enemy's every advantage. Simo made himself invisible by masking his gleam and his breath. Foss made his intentions invisible by never shooting at his target. The Japanese pilots were fighting a ghost. They were fighting an unseen alteration that wasn't composed of piano wire. It was created in the brain of a South Dakota hunter. Foss had single-handedly crushed their confidence.
He had demonstrated that the Zero was not, in fact, unbeatable. He had demonstrated that the inferior Wildcat, in the hands of a pilot who understood the science of the jackrabbit, was the deadliest weapon in the skies. The Japanese aces who used to shoot Wildcats for amusement were suddenly apprehensive. They were cautious. The Cactus Air Force was no longer the hunted. It was the hunter. And it all came down to one man who had been told he was too old to fight. But this win came at a horrible price. This is the cost that Simo Häyhä confronted. Foss's cost wasn't a single gunshot. It was a slow, excruciating burnout. Days after breaking the record, Foss was grounded for good. The malaria had finally won. He was now so sick he couldn't stand. He was battling periodic debilitating fevers. He had shed almost 30 pounds. The man who had fought down Zeros and sharks was being eaten alive from the inside. He didn't leave Guadalcanal in a triumphal parade. He was removed on a stretcher, a skeletal, yellow-skinned ghost, his body broken by the island he had helped save. He was airlifted to hospitals in the Pacific and then back to the United States. He was a national hero, but he was also an invalid. But Joe Foss had that sisu, that farmer's grit. He spent months in a military hospital in San Diego rehabilitating, and it was there that the nation he had served finally recognized him. On May 18, 1943, Joe Foss, the farmer from South Dakota, stood in the White House. President Franklin D. Roosevelt placed the Medal of Honor, the nation's highest award, around his neck. The citation lauded his dauntless courage and his exceptional battle abilities. But what was his true legacy? What was the ripple effect of his farmer's logic? It was hope. In 1942, America was losing the war. The Zero was a mythological monster. The Japanese were viewed as unstoppable. Joe Foss, with his 26 murders in just 44 days, destroyed that notion. He proved that an American farm lad in an American plane could beat the finest the enemy had. He didn't merely write a new chapter in air combat. He wrote the complete instruction on how to defeat the Zero. The deflection, firing, and thatch-weave tactics he devised became the new doctrine for the whole Pacific Fleet. He had saved Guadalcanal, and in doing so, he had helped turn the tide of the entire conflict. And what happens to a man who becomes the ace of aces when the conflict is over? Unlike Sergeant McKenna, whose modification remained a secret, Foss's courage was hailed. But like Simo Häyhä the farmer, he never forgot where he came from.
He didn't stay in the military. He headed home to South Dakota. He used his popularity not for himself, but for his people. He entered politics. He was elected to the South Dakota legislature, and in 1954, that same farmer who had been told he wasn't good enough was elected governor of South Dakota. He served his state just as he had served his country. He went on to become the first commissioner of the American Football League and a beloved national icon. But he was always, at his core, that man from the farm, the man who understood the sheer ruthless logic of the hunt. That's how conflicts are genuinely won, not by professionals or engineers who read from a manual, but by the individuals who see the flaw. James McKenna, the mechanic, spotted a problem in a P-38's control cord. He spotted a 3 to 8 inch slack that meant death, and he mended it with a 6-inch length of piano wire. Simo Haiha, the farmer, recognized the hole in the sniper doctrine. He noted that a high-tech scope glinted, and he repaired it by utilizing his old reliable iron sights. And Joe Foss, the country kid, recognized a defect in his inferior plane. He saw that you couldn't outturn a zero, but you could outthink it, and he mended it, not with a tool, but with the farmer's eye he had honed his entire life. These are the forgotten chapters, the stories of the men who defied the rules to win the war. Joe Foss died in 2003 at the age of 87. He was buried with full military honors, a hero to his nation, a legend to the Marine Corps, and a tribute to the invincible sisu of the American farmer. If you found this tale as riveting as we did, please take a moment to like this video. It helps us share more forgotten stories from the Second World War. Subscribe to remain connected with these unsung histories. Each one important. Each one deserves to be remembered. And we'd love to hear from you. Leave a comment below telling us where you're watching from. Our community ranges from Texas to Tasmania, from soldiers to history aficionados. You're part of something special here. Thank you for watching, and thank you for keeping these stories alive.